where we left off, we were talking about Confederate, uh, Confederate women. All right, so they, just like Northern women, they do try to mobilize to support soldiers. Um, they kind of stepped out of the traditional female sphere to run businesses as much as they could, to work in arms factories. In Richmond, women made up most of the clerking staff for the government, but a lot of their efforts at like aid societies was kind of disjointed and disorganized. The Confederacy didn't have any equivalent to the Sanitary Commission that would help women organize or give them direction. And with the Southern economy in such a shambles, they didn't have really much money to send or use to buy supplies. Having all of the home and farm responsibilities on their shoulders left them not very much time to nurse or to sew uniforms. They did what they could, but as the war went on and as the death toll rose, increasing numbers of women came to believe that the glorious cause was not worth the hellish cost. The letters that they wrote to their loved ones, especially in that last year of the war, are just pitiful, begging them to be safe and, in the words of one woman, to come home as soon as you can escape. Now, that contributed to a tremendous loss of morale, and it encouraged desertion from the army. The growing shortage of white manpower eventually led the Confederate government to a decision that they didn't want to make and did not expect that they would ever have to make when the war began. They authorized arming slaves to fight for the Confederacy. Now, I want to be clear. 0 slaves actually fought for the Confederacy. But in that last month of the war, the Confederate government authorized that program to begin. It just never got off the ground, and very likely would not have gotten off the ground even if the war had continued. But there had been people talking about that for quite a while. Back in late '63, there was a Mississippi newspaper that had argued in favor of freeing men and arming them and letting them join the Confederate military. Most slave owners wouldn't go along with that. They resist the idea of freeing their slaves, first of all, and more importantly, they really don't like the idea of arming someone who has a huge and very legitimate grudge. So it wasn't until March of '65, after General Lee supported the plan, that the Confederate Congress actually authorized it. Now, 0 black recruitment actually took place, assuming that it would have worked anyway. But as the Confederate Army did employ large numbers of African Americans, mostly slaves, as laborers and working in the laundry and handling animals, that has led to some confusion over whether African Americans actually fought on behalf of the Confederacy. There is no evidence that any black man or woman fought for the Confederacy. They don't seem to have picked up guns until they reached Union lines. But the South's decision to raise black troops illustrates how the war was undermining not just slavery as an institution, but the whole underlying ideology that had made slavery possible. Once the Confederate government decided that slaves could make good soldiers, they were essentially saying that slaves have all the qualities of free men, that they can be disciplined, they can be dedicated, they can be courageous, they can be all of those things that you want in a citizen. And once the Confederate government had admitted that, even if the war hadn't been over in April, that would have completely crumbled the foundation of slavery. Now, despite Lincoln fast-tracking emancipation, and despite the decline of morale in the Confederacy, the actual outcome of the war was still very much in doubt through the 3rd year into the beginning of the 4th year. In April of '63, so that's the start of the the third year of the war. General Joe Hooker brought the main Eastern Union force, the Army of the Potomac, into central Virginia to attack Lee at Chancellorsville. Lee was outnumbered 2-1, and he still repelled Hooker's attack. The Confederates did lose one of their best generals at Chancellorsville. They lost Stonewall Jackson, but they didn't lose him to a Union soldier. He was mistakenly shot by one of his own men. Lee decided to gamble on another invasion of the North. His strategic objectives this time are not entirely clear. He may have believed, like he had at Antietam, that a successful invasion of the North could make Union citizens turn against the war, if they thought their own homes were in danger. But also, by that point, Lee's army is running low on supplies, including food. And southern Pennsylvania it's a nice little breadbasket. But whyever he did it, Lee ended up meeting Union troops under the command of unofficially, General Number 7, General George Meade, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the first 3 days of July in 1863. Gettysburg remains the largest battle ever fought on the North American continent. 165,000 troops on both sides were involved. In this battle, the tables were turned. Usually, what would happen is the Confederates would choose their ground, they would dig in and defend, and the Union would have to attack. And the Confederates were very good at defending. But this time the Union had the upper hand. This time the Union got there first. They claimed the high ground, they defend, and the Confederates are in, for them, an unusual position of having to charge. And they're not that great, really, at offensive battle. They spent 2 days trying to dislodge Union troops, and then Lee decided that he was going to attack the center of the Union line. On the 3rd of July, Confederate forces led by Major General George Pickett marched across an open field toward the Union line. The Union had massed most of their artillery in the middle of this line facing this field, and so Pickett's men were just ripped apart by this artillery and rifle fire, and most of Pickett's men didn't even make it to the Union lines. 14,000 men began Pickett's charge. Fewer than half of them returned back to Confederate lines. Pickett's charge was Lee's worst blunder. They lost 3 brigade commanders. They lost all 13 of Pickett's regimental commanders. When the remainder of Pickett's men straggled back to the Confederate lines, Lee told Pickett to rally his division to prepare a defense. And Pickett allegedly responded, "General, I have no division." Lee's army had to retreat back to Virginia, and this time they do take some losses in their retreat, because Meade is not the gentleman that McClellan was. He will chase after a fleeing foe, and the Confederate army will never set foot on Union soil again. On the same day that Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg, the Union won another significant victory, but this one out in the west. Ulysses Grant had been trying to take the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi for literally months. Vicksburg sits really high on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, and it was the last Confederate stronghold on that river. The Union already held St. Louis because Missouri was a Union state. They'd captured New Orleans early in the war, and shortly after that they took Memphis. So Vicksburg is the only thing that is stopping the Union from using the Mississippi River to its full advantage. Grant is working with General Sherman, and they try to take Vicksburg by the railroad from the east, and that failed. They tried to cross the bayou and take Vicksburg that way, from the south, away from the artillery. They tried that 5 times, and every time they failed. Grant didn't want to send his troops from the north down the river because Vicksburg had a whole lot of guns, a whole lot of artillery perched up on the bluff. But eventually, that's what he had to do. He split his forces. He sent Sherman around to the east to fake attack the railroad again, and then Grant was able to land most of his men via the river. They circled around to the backside of Vicksburg, and then they had to lay siege to the city. It has already taken the better part of a year just to get close to Vicksburg, and the siege is going to take another 6 weeks. So for 6 weeks, we've got Confederate troops and civilians sitting in Vicksburg, running out of food, running out of clean water, with artillery shells constantly whistling overhead. They dug caves into the hills and moved all of their stuff into the caves because it was safer than staying in the houses. And then they ate the dogs. They ate the horses. They boiled shoe leather and tried to eat that. Half of the Confederate troops fell ill with scurvy and dysentery from the poor diet. And eventually they just surrendered. And Grant paroled all 30,000 of them. His logic is understandable. The Confederate troops are starving. Their morale is non-existent. A significant number of them can't even stand up. They're so sick. And Grant figures they'll never want to fight again. And besides that, if he had taken them prisoner, it would have taken a lot of his resources to ship them up north to the prisons. So instead, he just let them go. And the soldiers were very glad to be out of it. But most of them, once they're fed and once they're not sick anymore, will go right back into the Confederate Army, and Grant will have to fight them again. Now, the civilians in Vicksburg continued to have a little bit of resentment. Vicksburg surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863, and Vicksburg refused to celebrate the 4th of July from 1863 until 1942. But with the fall of Vicksburg, the entire Mississippi River was in Union hands. The Confederate defeats at Vicksburg and Gettysburg at the same time were a heavy blow to the South, but they were a shot of adrenaline for the Union. And Ulysses Grant rose even higher in Lincoln's estimation. He was promoted to Major General in the regular army, and he got a personal letter of apology from Lincoln, who had been criticizing the way that Grant carried out the Vicksburg campaign. Lincoln's letter ended by saying, literally, "You were right and I was wrong." Who wouldn't love to hear that from their boss? And as the war continues, Lincoln starts to think more and more seriously about that odd little drunken general out in the West. But there are still 2 years left in the war. In 1864, Lincoln finally brought Grant to the East and put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Grant kind of chucked the idea of taking Richmond. He will gladly take Richmond if it's there, but he doesn't see Richmond as the primary way to win this war. He understands that this is not a traditional war, that you've got to defeat the society. And so he begins a war of attrition against Lee's army in Virginia. A war of attrition means that Grant is able to take very high casualty rates among his own troops because the North has enough men to replace them, but the South doesn't. When Lee's army lost a man, they just lost a man. There's nobody to replace them. The Confederacy is losing men more quickly than their boys can grow up and take their place. But the North had over twice the population to begin with, and more immigrants are coming every day, so they can fight it out. One of the things that allowed Grant to do that early Union generals did not do is that early Union generals had attacked at specific strategic spots. That meant that the Confederates, with enough advance notice and generally being pretty good at predicting where that attack would come, the Confederates were able to concentrate their forces to defend that specific strategic location. anticipation. Like if you know the Union's going to attack near Richmond, you gather all your men up to defend. But if you don't know where Grant is going to attack, if eventually you realize that he's not that focused on Richmond, or worse, if Grant can take the massive numerical advantage that the Union has and splits his army up into like 5 different groups, then what is the Confederacy supposed to do? You can't concentrate all of your men in one spot, because then you'll lose the other 4 spots. And Lee doesn't have enough men to send a decently sized force to defend all of those spots where he thinks Grant might attack. So here's Grant working with Sherman, just attacking all over the place and never letting up. At least when McClellan was in charge, the Confederates could get some breathing space because he would at least let them retreat. Grant wouldn't do that. In May of '64, Grant led 115,000 men in the Army of the Potomac across the Rapidan River to attack Lee in Virginia. And a month of the war's bloodiest fighting followed. Grant and Lee first met each other at the Battle of the Wilderness. The Wilderness is this wild, unmapped, shrub-covered region in Virginia where, according to one soldier, it was as though Christian men had turned to fiends, and hell itself had usurped the place of earth. Grant's men suffered 18,000 casualties, 18,000 dead, wounded, and captured. Lee only had 7,500, but Lee had a lot fewer men to begin with. Now, any Union general before Grant would have broken off the fighting and would have retreated after 18,000 casualties. But Grant didn't retreat. He kept pushing on. He attacked Lee at Spotsylvania, then again at Cold Harbor. At the end of 6 weeks of fighting, Grant had taken 60,000 casualties. Grant had almost as many men, dead, wounded, and captured, as Lee had in the entire Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had only taken 30,000 casualties, but for Lee, that's half his army. For Grant, 60,000 is easily replaceable. This sustained fighting in Virginia, this marks a turning point in modern warfare. With this daily combat and these redonkulous casualty tolls, this kind of battle has a lot more in common with the style of warfare that we'll see in World War I than with the traditional, old-fashioned, gentlemanly style of fighting that the Civil War had started with. Grant was really the only Union general to keep up the initiative against Lee, but he did it at such a cost that it led his critics to call him a butcher. They called him a reckless drunk. They called Sherman an unhinged loon, which was sort of true, actually. Now, Grant never drank before a battle. It was very important to him that everybody understand he never drank before a battle. He drank afterwards in his tent and cried. Grant isn't sending his men to die because he gets a kick out of it. He's doing it because he wants the war over. But even after this 6 weeks, he doesn't have a hardcore, decisive victory in the East. Lincoln still believes in Grant. In response to attack on Grant's drinking problem, Lincoln said, "Find out what brand he drinks, send a crate of it to all my generals." Now, Grant tried to capture Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg is the railroad hub of Virginia, and it controls the supply lines into Richmond. But Lee got to Petersburg first, and Grant had to settle in for a long siege. Now, we know that Lee is good at defense, but we also know that Grant is good at sieges. He spent the next almost a year cutting off every conceivable line into Petersburg, until eventually Lee had to give up and skedaddle, but we're not quite there yet. While Grant is working up this Petersburg plan, Sherman is heading into Tennessee. The Confederates keep after him, but in September of '64, Sherman reached the city of Atlanta, which was Georgia's main railroad hub, one of the biggest southern transport hubs of all. As casualties mounted in the spring and summer of '64, Northern morale sank to its lowest point. Lincoln worried that he might not win re-election. John Fremont was the governor of Missouri. He ran as a radical Republican. Fremont's platform called for a constitutional amendment banning slavery and the confiscation of all trader property, including all land. Now, Fremont's platform did not mean capturing the property and the land of every member of the Confederacy, not even every member of the Confederate Army. He's specifically targeting those men who had once taken an oath of loyalty to the United States and then broken it. That would cover almost the entire Confederate Congress, because most of them had been members of the U.S. Congress, and they had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution and the law of the land, and then they broke it when they joined the Confederacy. It would also cover the entire officer corps of the Confederate military, but it would not cover most of the privates, the regular guys. It wouldn't really affect them. The Democrats, there is still a Northern Democratic Party. They ran General McClellan. His platform was an immediate ceasefire. And the North is tired of war, but that just sounded a little too much like surrender. In the end, McClellan withdrew, and then Sherman took Atlanta, and then Lincoln was swept to victory on this wave of excitement. As the war drew to a close, and more parts of the Confederacy came under Union control, federal authorities found themselves trying to figure out what happens next. How do we transition from slavery to freedom? In different places across the South, in South Carolina and Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley, there were all sorts of debates over issues like land and labor and political rights. And those debates will continue to affect the United States long after the war and really into the present day. Now, when we talk about Reconstruction means the job of bringing the Confederacy back into the U.S. as U.S. states and the people as U.S. citizens with rights. But there was a massive debate over who should have which rights, particularly what kinds of rights former slaves should have. The most famous at the time rehearsal for Reconstruction took place on the Sea Islands, just off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. The war was barely a few months old when the Union Navy captured those islands. All the plantation owners fled, and they left behind about 10,000 slaves, former slaves, not sure what they are right in the beginning. The Navy was soon followed by other Northerners, investors, reformers, especially members of a group called Gideon's Band. Gideon's Band was made up of mostly Northern African Americans and a few Northern whites who were committed to education and reform. And each of these groups, the reformers, the military, the investors, and of course the former slaves themselves, they all have a slightly different idea of who gets what rights and how we can best transition to freedom. And journalists reported every development that was happening on the Sea Islands to this eager reading public in the North. This was the feel-good story of that era. Like every new school that was built was a triumph. The reformers are convinced that education was the key to teaching slaves how to be self-reliant, productive citizens. So Northern-born teachers like Charlotte Forten devoted themselves to teaching the former slaves. Charlotte Forten was a member of Philadelphia's one of their most prominent black families. Laura Town was another teacher that was affiliated with Gideon's band. She established a school on St. Helena Island in 1862 and stayed there, administering the entire island school system until she died in the early 1900s. Like many of the Gideonites, Towne and Fortin assumed that former slaves needed somebody else to teach them how to appreciate their freedom. But at least they sympathized with the dreams of the slaves and with their desires for freedom, like the desire for land, as a foundation of freedom. Other Northerners, especially white Northerners, believed that slaves should not have land, shouldn't be given it, and shouldn't even be allowed to buy it. They believed that that was too much freedom, that former slaves would not understand how to handle themselves with that much freedom. They believed that former slaves should work for wages, should work in more humane conditions than they'd had as slaves, but should still have to work for white people. When the land on the Sea Islands was confiscated by the government and put up for sale, almost all of it was bought by northern white investors, not by the former slaves who had lived there and worked on it and made that land profitable in the first place. But the investors do at least want to hire the former slaves. We'll let them build houses, we'll let them send their children to school, we'll let them have a community. By 1865, the Sea Island experiment was considered this blazing success. Black parents worked for wages, their children got educations, they had better clothes, they had safer homes, they had better food than they'd had as slaves. But the Sea Islands experiment continued that contentious issue of whether or not land ownership should be part of freedom. Land ownership has been the foundation of freedom since European contact in North America. How much land you had determined what your rights and privileges were. Some of the earliest rebellions in the British colonies were over access to land. And even into the 1800s, voting rights were restricted over access to land based on land ownership. You remember the Boer War. And there is still this intense belief that owning land is what made a man truly independent and self-sufficient. So when former slaves sending petitions saying that they want the ability to buy land, this is not a definition of freedom that they have just pulled out of thin air that is baffling to white Americans. This is a really old, widely understood path to freedom. Now, a very different rehearsal for Reconstruction took place in Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley. This one involved a much larger area and a much bigger population than the Sea Island experiment. After the capture of Vicksburg, the Union Army established these labor regulations all through the Mississippi Valley. The Army, the military authorities, said that former slaves had to sign labor contracts with plantation owners, usually with their own former owners. And the owners, in order to get that labor from their former slaves, would have to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. Now, unlike before the war, the former slaves would have to be paid wages, and their children must have some access to school. Physical punishment, whipping, that is outlawed, and they cannot be sold off. So there are some protections for freedmen families, but neither side was really happy with this. The planters don't like it. They complain that their former slaves, now employees, are insubordinate. They act like they're free or something. Planters said that it wasn't fair that they couldn't whip their workers anymore. The former slaves really resent, and I think we can all understand why, having to go right back to working for the same people who used to own them, instead of being able to go out west, get some land of their own. And they resent having to sign these labor contracts that the vast majority of them can't read. And the terms of the contract that was actually written down wasn't always what they were told it said. Sometimes Army officers tried very different kinds of experiments, like Ulysses Grant, when he was still in charge of the Army of the Tennessee. He had seized Jefferson Davis's plantation, Davis Bend, Mississippi. At Davis Bend, he did not make former slaves sign labor contracts. Instead, he divided the land up among the different slave families. They were allowed to set up their own towns, to elect their own sheriffs, their own judges. They established kind of a farmers' cooperative community that lasted until after the Civil War. But eventually, the Davis family will be able to take all of it back from them in the early 1880s. As the Civil War goes on, as we get closer to the end, the status of African Americans became this dividing line in public debates. The events in Louisiana, Union-occupied Louisiana, brought those issues to national attention. Louisiana is sort of the first Confederate state to almost entirely come under Union control. So Lincoln wants to establish a functioning civilian government in Louisiana to be this example that they can use as the other Confederate states fall under Union control. And so Lincoln announced what he called the 10% Plan of Reconstruction, which is what this graphic is showing. In the 10% Plan, Lincoln essentially offered amnesty for all crimes, including treason, and full restoration of rights and property, except for slaves, to nearly any white Southerner who would swear a loyalty oath. And once 10% of the adult men in Louisiana took that oath, then they could form a new state government. They could come back into the Union. The only thing that they would be required to do in this new state government was abolish slavery. Lincoln's 10% Plan had no guarantee of rights aside from no slavery for African Americans. It had no role for them at all. His leniency toward Louisiana Confederates was strongly criticized. But Lincoln believed that by playing nice, he would get more men to come back into the Union. That would weaken the Confederacy. The free black population in New Orleans saw Union control of Louisiana as a golden opportunity to demand equality in the law and a role in government. They criticized the 10% Plan strongly because it gave them neither of those things. And they got a lot of sympathy from radical Republicans in Congress. By the summer of '64, dissatisfaction with the Louisiana situation helped to inspire the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill required a majority, more than 50%, of white men in a state to swear that loyalty oath, not just the 10%. The Wade-Davis bill also guaranteed African American equality before the law and in the court system, but it did not mention the right to vote. That bill passed in Congress, but Lincoln vetoed it. As the war drew to a close, it was clear that, yeah, slavery's dead, but we don't know what's going to take its place. After Lincoln's re-election, the war tumbled on to its conclusion. In November of 1864, just after Lincoln's re-election, Sherman and his army of 60,000 set out from Atlanta on their march to the sea. The march from Atlanta to Savannah was 300 miles, and Sherman's army spread 60 miles wide. So that's 18,000 square miles of damage and destruction. They destroyed railroads and buildings. They carted off the food and supplies that they could carry and then destroyed what they couldn't carry. Sherman said that his goal was to whip the rebels, to follow them to their innermost recesses and make them fear and dread us. This is this new kind of war of society versus society. This is total warfare in all of its destructiveness. Now, very few civilians were harmed in Sherman's march to the sea. You can't hide a 60,000 man army So everybody knew that they were coming before they arrived. As they marched, the slaves on the plantations that they crossed joined them. In January of 65, after he captured Savannah, Sherman moved on into South Carolina, caused even more destruction on his march to Charleston. We don't usually remember that one because there's not a song about it. There's a song about the March to the Sea. Anarchy took over the plantations. Slaves drove off the overseers. They claimed the land for themselves. On January 13th, 1865, Congress, both houses of Congress, approved the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment is what finally abolished slavery throughout the entire nation. And this is actually the first time that the word slavery appears in the Constitution. The whole time that it protected slavery, it did so without using the word. In March of 65, Lincoln's second inauguration was held, and in his speech, Lincoln called for reconciliation. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." But he also spoke harshly about America's sins. He said this terrible war was God's punishment for the sin of slavery. And if God willed that it continued until all of the wealth created by slavery had been destroyed, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, then that will be God's act of justice. April of 65 brought some of the most momentous events in U.S. history. On April 2nd, Grant finally broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg. He forced Lee to flee. Grant unseated an entrenched army, which was practically a miracle for this era. And that left the area around Richmond defenseless. So Union soldiers just went ahead and took Richmond on April the 3rd. At the head of one Black Army unit, their chaplain was marching. Garland White was his name. He had been a former fugitive slave himself. And the crowd called on him to make a speech. And he said the doors of all the slave pens were thrown open, and thousands came out shouting and praising God. The next day, that would be April 4th, Lincoln went to Richmond. He walked the streets of Richmond, and at every step he was besieged by these former slaves, and some of them fell on their knees. It was very embarrassing for him. The city of Richmond lay in ruins because Lee and his troops had set fire to the munitions warehouse before they retreated. But the war's still not over. You know, in the traditional war, you take the capital, that ends it. We have the capital. But there's still a fighting army in the field. A few of them. Lee is running out of men. He is desperate to meet up with any other Confederate commander to try and combine their armies. He wants to meet up with Joe Johnston's Confederate troops and combine their forces. But Johnston was busy running away from Sherman. And Lee's men are out of food. They are out. They spend so much time foraging for food that they lost their head start against Grant. Over the next 4 days, Lee and Grant will fight 7 battles. They'll fight, Lee's men will retreat, they'll have to stop to patch up their wounded, to try and gather some food. Grant will catch them and they'll fight again. Lee's final battle was fought on April 9th. And by 8 o'clock that morning, Grant had received a note from Lee asking for a meeting to discuss surrender. Let's sidetrack for a minute and talk about the life of just a random Confederate citizen, Wilmer McLean. McLean had owned, at the start of the war, a piece of land up in northern Virginia, a place that he called Yorkshire Plantation. Yorkshire Plantation is right outside Manassas Junction. Bull Run Creek runs through it. And at the first Battle of Bull Run, a cannonball came down his chimney into his kitchen. So McLean decided that the war that's getting too close for comfort. This is a little dicey. So he sold Yorkshire Plantation and he moved further south into Virginia, where he thought nobody would find him. He moved to this sleepy little town called Appomattox Courthouse. And on the morning of April 9th, Wilmer McLean opened his door to a messenger asking if General Lee could use his front parlor. So the war starts in his backyard, and it ends in his front parlor. And then all of the soldiers who were there to witness the signing of the surrender, carted off everything in his house. They took the table that it was signed on and all the chairs, and they took his curtains and they took his silverware as these souvenirs of Lee's surrender. Now, Grant's terms in the surrender were very generous. He said that Lee's men would not be imprisoned, would not be prosecuted for treason. They can just go home. As long as they leave and as long as they don't take up arms again, they will be free. Grant also let them take not just their personal horses, but the army horses and mules, because it's spring, they need to do the planting. He gave them food rations out of the Union's stores so that they wouldn't starve before they got home. Now, there were a couple of smaller Confederate forces still in the field, and there will be a handful of skirmishes. The last general in command of a significant Confederate allied force didn't surrender until June of '64. That would be Stand Watie of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. But the Confederate government was dissolved long before that. The Confederate government dissolved on the 5th of May. Lincoln didn't live to see that. On April 11th, he gave his final speech. He publicly, for the first time, called for black suffrage, for voting rights for black men. But 3 days later, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth in the Ford's Theater, and he died the next morning. A train carried his body back to Illinois on this winding 1,600-mile journey through all of the major northern cities so everyone can pay their respects. And on the 4th of May, he was laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois. The Civil War laid the foundation for modern America. It guaranteed the permanence of the nation. In a way, it created our modern idea of the nation. It destroyed slavery. It shifted power from southern planters to northern industrialists. It drastically increased the power of the federal government. It sped up the modernization of the northern economy, and it placed African American freedom on the post-war agenda. But both sides lost something that they'd gone to war to defend. The Confederacy had gone to war to defend slavery. It was the cornerstone of their society, and the war destroyed it. In the North, the war destroyed Lincoln's America, that nation of small shops, independent farmers. By the end of the war, was an industrial giant. Late in May 1865, a little over a month after Lincoln's death, 200,000 Union veterans paraded through D.C. for what they called the Grand Review of the Union Armies, this last celebration of the nation's triumph. And that scene inspired a poet named Bret Harte to imagine a very different parade, a phantom army of the Union dead. He wrote, "The martyred heroes of Lamburn Hill, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, the men whose wasted figures fill the patriot graves of the nation. And marching beside the others came the dusky martyrs of Pillow's fight, with limbs enfranchised and bearing bright." To Harte, the meaning of the war lay in the sacrifices of the soldiers, and he included black troops, including those who were massacred at Fort Pillow. He's asking, African Americans have achieved equality in death, but can the nation give it to them in life? And that is the question that confronts American society as the post-war Reconstruction really begins. Frederick Douglass said, "The work does not end with the abolition of slavery. It only begins there." That is the end of the Civil War and the end of the lectures for this class.